Hello and welcome to the American Baptist Church's Creation Justice Network's Conversation Series with our Creation Justice Congregations program. We will be putting together several conversations with congregations who are embracing creation justice ministries. I am the Reverend Rebecca Driscoll, the ABC Minister for Creation Justice, and your host for these conversations. Today, I am here with the Reverend Betsy Sowers, who serves as the Minister for Earth Justice at Old Cambridge Baptist Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In this role, Reverend Sowers serves as a resource person to the pastoral team and congregation to help interpret the climate crisis and sustainability issues within a context of worship, prayer, education, and action, both personal and public. She helps members of the congregation connect the dots between earth justice and the other justice concerns that are intimately intertwined with it, especially racial, economic, gender, and immigration refugee justice, and the possibility of just peace and redemptive community in a climate-stressed world. Previously, Reverend Sowers has worked as a flight attendant, served as director in the Department of Church and Society of the American Baptist Churches of Massachusetts, and held the role of adjunct associate director for the Massachusetts Council of Churches. Reverend Sowers has been instrumental in the integration of environmental justice and the life of faith at Old Cambridge Baptist Church. In January of this year, Old Cambridge Baptist Church voted to become an ABC USA Creation Justice congregation. Welcome, Reverend Sowers. It's so great to chat with you today.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's great to be here.
So as we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you first became interested in creation justice?
Well, yes, I grew up in Florida and was just outside all the time with nature and either on the water, at the beach. Our home was on a lake, and there were always birds and fish, and so it was just kind of in my blood growing up to care about nature. And I'm old enough to remember. I was just thinking about the 60s when President Johnson's wife, Lady Bird, was beautifying America and taking down the billboards on the highways and scolding everybody for littering, because littering was just rampant back then. I remember Rachel Carson fighting DDT when all of the birds were dying off. And I remember the first Earth Day in 1970, which was the year I graduated from college. And just that there was a huge movement, back then. This is not a new thing. You also mentioned that I was a flight attendant. Right after college, I worked for Pan American World Airways for a while, and I saw up close and personal all of the environmental impacts and the terrible air pollution that was all over the world there, as well as the amazing beauty of nature all over the world. But I would say back in those days, it was only a matter of faith to me in the broadest sense of the word, that, this is God's creation and isn't it wonderful and shouldn't we take care of it? I didn't understand it as a matter of justice. That came really in seminary. I actually went to seminary because I had gotten involved in the women's movement in church, actually at Old Cambridge Baptist Church, and feminist and womanist theology. And we were all about changing the church, to be more equitable to women, and the theologies that went around that. And in seminary, that's where I made the connection between feminist theology and Black theology, LGBTQ theology, and theology that really is caring for nature and critiquing this kind of toxic theology where humans, and particularly male humans, are to be dominant over everything, and where both people and nature become objects that are that have no value on their own except as they're useful to the people who are in power. So I've been on that track ever since. But it's really only in the last decade that creation justice came to the center of what I'm doing. I was actually technically retired from ministry, and then as several frontline things came up. The university divestment movement, I got involved in that as an alumna of several campuses that I've been part of. And then I started getting involved in frontline community work in two different communities near where I live. And actually where I live right now is a frontline community where there's a fracked gas project that we're fighting. And then my pastor, Cody Sanders, said, you know, you're doing all this work, and I was also sharing all this work with the congregation. You really should have a job title. So,
and there you go.
And so now here I am, Minister for Earth Justice at Old Cambridge Baptist Church, working both inside and outside of the church on environmental justice and creation justice. And so that's a long story, but that's how it happened.
That's a wonderful story. Yeah, and so with your work with Old Cambridge Baptist Church, and they have come into their own environmental justice ministry that includes prayer and worship, Christian education, and a commitment to reducing carbon footprints, and then community advocacy as well. And so on the congregation's website, it states, as a people, we believe that all creation is sacred and interconnected. We are called to prophetic speech and action to stop the destruction of our life-sustaining ecosystem for profit. We are equally called to be agents of healing and compassion in a world where climate catastrophes already stoke conflicts, mass migrations of refugees, and competition for dwindling resources, which is a beautiful statement of purpose in creation justice ministries. Can you talk a little bit more about the formation of this purposeful ministry that Old Cambridge Baptist Church has felt called to?
Sure, I'd love to, because I think for other congregations, the journey at Old Cambridge can be a model. And not that we're there, we're still very much on the journey, but how we came to where we are. The congregation, I think, has had a long time commitment to justice ministries. That's really part of our self-identity of being a peace and justice congregation. And a long time sense of personal and corporate environmental responsibility. Back in the 90s, there was a catch basin put under the parking lot to catch rainwater that waters our gardens. And we have a couple of gardeners who have now expanded their gardening ministry to include a lot of the younger people and the children. So we have these beautiful gardens with native plants and organic soil, and that's really created an oasis for the neighborhood because it's very urban. And also creatures. We have turkeys who live in our gardens.
Oh, wow.
It's quite remarkable. We have many people in the congregation who are vegetarians or vegans, and worked on, living more sustainable lifestyles, living more simply. We've had Mass Interfaith Power and Light come in and help us with our building to make that more sustainable. Limiting waste, all of those kinds of things. That's been going on for a very long time before I even got engaged with this ministry. But here's what made the difference. In 2015, we did a book group, and we read Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything. And it changed everything. Because what it did is it reframed our ministry from this personal purity, if you will, of it's all about us and our lifestyles, which are important, but not all of it, to being a matter of justice. And it showed how environmental injustice is linked to economic injustice, is linked to racism, is linked to the status of women globally, is linked to, as your reading of the webpage says, is linked to mass migration and war, and all of these things are connected to climate justice and environmental justice. So it's like this little light bulb went off, and people went, oh my goodness, now we get it. It's a justice issue alongside with the other justice issues, and not something we do just only in our personal lives. So it really became a central part of how we understand to be following Jesus to be in the life of the congregation. That of course this is a justice issue along with the other justice issues, and it's connected to all of them. So we shifted, we still do all those other things, but we shifted into doing more legislative and policy advocacy, showing up at demonstrations, the big global climate demonstrations that happened all over the world. We've been present at actions in frontline communities trying to stop fossil fuel projects. As a congregation, we joined the Paris Pledge and created a climate justice fund to be used for climate justice ministries. And as an aside, one of the ways we fund that is that we recommend that when people from the congregation fly, that they contribute 3 cents a mile as a carbon offset to our climate justice fund.
That's a really creative idea.
It is, and there's a little app online that makes it really easy to do. You just put, where you started and where you ended in your flight, and it tells you how many miles you went, and you just multiply it by 3 cents. So, yeah. And then over the past couple of years, we've also been moving. This is one of my favorite things. We've really been moving theologically, and not just in action, with Bible study and preaching that centers this connection, this interconnection of all creation in the Holy One, and the active role of the more than human in our sacred stories. And I want to give a big shout out to Cody Sanders, our pastor, because he's been just preaching some remarkable sermons. And it's not just on Earth Sunday, that just he's doing a series on Mark right now, and saying you can't understand Mark without understanding escape in it, and the role of the creatures, like the dove, who is part of the Trinity, who is a creature, so it's like almost every sermon and every Bible study and every not every adult forum, but many adult forums have an aspect in it. It's just like mainstreamed into the way we think about things. So that's some of how we have moved. Oh, and then I would say, and the last part of that is that all of that kind of led to when the Creation Justice Congregations program came along, we said, well, yes, of course, we would want to be part of that too.
Yeah, that was my next question. How did you, after embracing and embodying all of these different creation justice ministries, what did that discernment process look like to say, yes, we also would like to be a creation justice congregation with the ABC and the ABC's Creation Justice Network?
Yeah, it didn't take a lot of discernment. It took a fair amount of time, and part of that was because of COVID, because I had gone to speak with our deacons about it, like right before COVID hit, and then it required a congregational vote, and there was a meeting coming up, but that meeting got all taken up with COVID, and then there wasn't another one until recently. So it ended up falling through the cracks because of the COVID crisis. But there was really never any dissension. As soon as people found out about it, they said, "Oh yeah, this is something we should do." So it was not contentious at all.
Yeah, and we are so excited to have you as part of this community, embracing creation justice in ministry events. And Old Cambridge Baptist Church has held a lot within the congregation, a lot of different events, but also has engaged in the wider community. Do you or the congregation have a favorite event or engagement activity that you have participated in?
Oh my goodness, there are so many. Yeah, we do every year. At least 2 of our adult ed events are focused on environment, and I just already said preaching and worship. I think probably my favorite is back in 2015. Harvard University, which is across the street from us, had a week-long event called Harvard Heat Week. which was all about getting students and faculty and alumni all on board to push the university to divest from fossil fuels, which they still haven't done. But we've been working at it. And I had gotten involved in that, and we ended up having OCBC, Old Cambridge, be a site for a kickoff worship service right before the Heat Week started. And we had invited Tim DeChristopher to preach and lead an adult forum at that kickoff. And Tim, for those who don't know, was then a very young man. He was in his early 20s. In 2008, he was arrested for bidding on oil leases that were being offered illegally on pristine public land out west by the Bureau of Land Management. And he just went to look, he just went to be present at the event, but he was so moved by what was happening that he started bidding on the oil leases. And of course, he had no money to pay for them. So he was criminally charged and served almost 2 years in federal prison.
Oh, wow.
But he ended up saving thousands of acres of this land, because the awareness that he created is that people actually realized that the cession there was illegal and those lands shouldn't have been leased. So and there was a film called Bitter 70 that told his story. So after his release, he's a person of deep faith. He came to Harvard Divinity School to study for the ministry, which is why he was in Cambridge. And he brought a really powerful message to us about, talk about somebody who's really put his life on the line for creation justice,
right,
for us and our Harvard guests. So that's probably my favorite. But we've also done a lot of events, and for time's sake, that one just stands out as one that was really, really powerful.
Are there any that you found most challenging, particularly difficult to conduct or to host?
Well, that particular one was probably the most complicated, because it involved a lot of other organizations. But no, I think a lot of congregations may have more challenges with people not being in agreement that we ought to be doing these sorts of things. And that has not been a problem at Old Cambridge. So I guess my advice to folks where it is a problem is to start with the theology and, have people really, really examine what it means to follow Jesus in light of this climate crisis and its connections with all of the other people on the margins and so on, and nature itself that we care about as people who care about creation.
Yeah, and really ground it in the scriptural passages. And have scripture.
Yeah, and actually, now that you mentioned scripture, Cody Sanders and I attended a conference in 2018 sponsored by our friends at the Alliance of Baptists, where eco-theologian Ched Myers did Bible studies, and just absolutely blew us all away. And I think that's where we really got on a theological roll, because he did, from Genesis to Revelation, showed us all of the ways that nature is an actor in the biblical stories, and not just, like, with apologies to say Shakespeare, not just the stage on which humans all act out our little dramas. Whether it's the Red Sea parting, or the dove, coming down into Jesus, or the tree of life and the river in Revelation when the New Jerusalem comes down. There's all of these ways that nature is so essential to our biblical tradition, and that the people, so many people now are looking at indigenous traditions for wisdom, and that's that's wonderful. I mean, there is an enormous amount of knowledge. But our scriptures also come from an indigenous tradition, especially the Hebrew scriptures. And the people were so close to the land, and they were agricultural people and herders, and all of those stories that have nature and creatures in them that we often read as metaphors, they weren't metaphors for those folks. Yeah, that was their life, and it was life and death stuff. So I really commend that kind of Bible study to congregations, because it really undergirds the action stuff.
Yeah, I had a conversation with someone earlier this week, and they were mentioning that trees, after humans, are the piece of nature that is most mentioned in the Bible. And the significance and the role that trees play in our lives, and in the interconnectedness.
Yeah, there was just came across my desk, and maybe I'll send you a link to share with folks, an article. Someone sent me an article from Christian Century just this week on trees and Lent that is just beautiful. And it talks about the tree that Jesus was crucified on, and, you know, and the relationship between Jesus and the tree, and then just trees in general. It's beautiful. I'll send it to you to share with us.
Thank you so much. So you mentioned that the Harvard Week events that you put together, you had partnered and collaborated with some other people and community organizations. Are there particular collaborations that you have found to be primarily fruitful? Are there other ones that you're seeking out that you hope to collaborate with at some point? What does that look like, your collaboration with local community organizations?
Yeah, well, there's one that I do every week. Is I have a newsletter on Earth Justice that goes out to people in the congregation, and also a whole bunch of ecumenical and interfaith colleagues. And of course, I get all of their newsletters. So we're collaborating all the time on sharing events and, you know, things that and faith-based events that have to do with climate justice. So that's really helpful about just knowing what's going on. We've had an ongoing relationship with Mass Interfaith Power and Light, which is very helpful, both in terms of our own building and also because they keep an eye on state legislative issues and policy issues as a part of, there's a larger coalition in Massachusetts called Mass Power Forward that's like 150 organizations. And many of the faith communities are involved in that, and we are involved in that via Mass Interfaith Power and Light, so we keep abreast of what's going on with legislation and policy. Right around the corner from our church is the office for Mass 350 Mass and Climate Crew, which does climate resilience, is housed with them as well. And we were able, actually, from OCBC to introduce Climate Crew to Creation Justice Ministries at the national level. And they're now working together to do climate resilience programs in churches all over the place. And OCBC just recently became a climate resilience hub as related to Climate Crew. So that's a new relationship that we're just getting started with, just as we are just getting started with this one with you. So we're looking forward to seeing how those develop. We have done just a bunch of interfaith things. We've had a couple of interfaith services in West Roxbury, Mass, and Weymouth, Mass, where I live, where there are fossil fuel projects, where there was worship and then actions, some of which resulted in arrests of faith leaders. We had a huge, in 2018, exodus from fossil fuels interfaith event at the State House, right around Holy Week and the High Holy Day, or the holy days of the Jewish folks. So that was very cool. And there's right now, there were two events, one on February 2nd and one coming up on the 16th. We're involved with the Jewish Climate Action Network because they're working with National Wildlife Federation to do the Sacred Grounds program to bring that to New England. And I and our lead gardener are participating in those webinars to introduce congregations to doing things with their grounds. So all of those are kind of exciting. Oh, and you asked about new things. There's a new organization called Mass Renews that's at least a part of the leadership, and that is faith-based, that's going to be working at the intersection of climate justice, racial justice, economic justice, housing, all of that stuff in New England and in Massachusetts. And actually tomorrow's the launch meeting of that. So that's really exciting.
Yeah.
And it is connected to something I forgot to mention about Old Cambridge, is that we are looking right now to do a ministry focus to really organize the congregation around ministry at the intersection of climate justice and racial justice. And we have two new teams forming, one that's going to growing out of an ad hoc group that's been meeting for several years. They're going to be an official team on racial justice, and then we're going to start another team that's more focused on the climate justice, and then those two groups will be in conversation with each other. So that's pretty exciting. So we're going to see, where that goes.
Yeah, that intersection and understanding the intersectionality of climate justice, creation justice, and racial justice, and immigration justice, gender justice, economic justice. Yes. That's so important. And I think that's something that often gets left out of the conversation about why creation justice is so important, but it really lays the foundation and is connected to all the other justice issues. So
absolutely. And none of the other.
That is a conversation that needs to start a little bit more, I think.
Yes. Yeah. And I was going to say that all of those other justice matters that we care about so deeply are all just going to get that much worse if the climate crisis continues to unwind,
right,
as it is. And maybe I should say a word about environmental justice, in case not everyone is aware that climate justice is the big overarching situation and justice matter, but environmental justice is a specific legal category that has to do, where there are laws and policies, both at the federal and state legislatures, about impacted communities, whether they're communities of color or low wealth or English as a second language, immigrant communities that are actually designated by census tracts and that is supposed to be considered when polluting facilities or dumps or whatever are to be cited. They're supposed to be protected, which is not always the case, because for more than 50 years, the easiest way to find out where a polluting facility is to look at the color of the people who live there. Right? And so that's environmental justice. Climate justice is the bigger picture. But I think a lot of people don't realize that those are two things that are kind of overlapping.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. I think that is very helpful. So as COVID-19 pandemic has required us to abide by social distancing protocols, have you had to reimagine with Old Cambridge Baptist Church what the creation justice ministries look like for you and your partners? Has that required you to reimagine what's possible and what things you can accomplish in ministry?
Yes and no. First of all, I think, the legislative and policy work went remote pretty easily. So that hasn't been a problem. It's just kind of mushing along. And actually, one thing that was planned for this fall, which went somewhat easier, is that we were replacing our old expensive, dirty heating system with a cleaner heating system. And because of COVID, everybody was out of the building. So that actually went easier than it might have been if we had been actually all in the building. And we have tenants in the building as well who are not there right now, which is causes a whole other series of problems, but they're not climate related. The thing that was harder and is still harder is frontline actions. Doing demonstrations is harder. We've done some standout, socially distanced masked standouts. Mm-hmm. But where I am in Weymouth, we're fighting this. Enbridge International Corporation is trying to start a fracked gas compressor station in our community, right next to 2 environmental justice communities. And we have been fighting them for 6 years. And we had just begun a series of actions with people risking arrest, with more each time. And then COVID hit, and that just came to a screeching halt. So, because not only did we not want our neighbors to risk COVID by going into jails and courts, but we didn't want to risk taking COVID into those places where there are people who didn't choose to be there, right. And we didn't want to exercise our privilege to risk the lives and health of people who weren't there. So we had to, we did some car parades instead, driving by the site with signs and whatnot. And we've done some, as I said, socially distant standouts with signs. But that's been very frustrating. And I think people all over, all kinds of movements, have been very frustrated about the dangers and the risks of doing public actions. So that's just something that's going to continue to be a problem until it's safe to be together again.
Right. Yeah, it's one of the frustrations of this kind of ministry and advocacy work that many congregations are involved in across our geographical ABC regions and also across different denominations and faith traditions. So when you think about these setbacks and the degradation of the earth, it can often be overwhelming. Where do you find God in this ministry, and where do you see hope?
Well, I find God in, again, back to the theology, I find God in creation. I mean, God is, there's the wonderful text I think it's in Genesis 2, where God is breathing, has made Adam, the earth creature, which is what Adam is, made earth creature out of the dust, and God is blowing into this creature the breath of life. And the Hebrew word, I only found this out like last year, the Hebrew word for that is the same word that you use when a woman is panting in labor. That kind of, it's not just like a nice little puff of air. It's like this, giving birth. And I just love that image of God who made the soil, that kind of taking the earth that we're made of and blowing like a woman in labor into it, and extending that to all of creation that was brought to birth by God, and and that every little piece of it is interconnected and dependent on each other. And so God is in every one of those relationships, our relationships with our fellow human beings, and with the more than human creation. So I find God there, hope, and there's the text, hope in the Lord, that our hope is in God. I find a lot of hope in the community, this beloved community of people who are doing this hard work together, both at my church and in the frontline communities that I work with. The hard work of climate justice and racial justice, and building our community beyond the human. It's just really holy, and it's really powerful. And I would just say lastly about hope is that it's really important that we don't attach hope to success or winning.
Yeah.
of course we want to win. Of course we want to succeed. Of course we want to end environmental injustice, and we want to stop climate change. And right here where I live, we want to stop Enbridge. But that's not at bottom, that's not the only reason we do it. We do it because we're following a call together that's rooted in our faith and in the integrity of our purpose. And we're being good ancestors, to the people and the creatures who come after us. So whether or not we win, we are doing what we're doing because it's right and because it's our way of following Jesus. And, so if I always say, if the ship goes down, we'll go down singing, because, and we'll be singing hymns of thanksgiving to God for having been placed in this moment of opportunity to make a difference, and having been faithful and done what we could.
Yeah, so there are a lot of congregations within the ABC that are discerning what embodying creation care might look like. I was really excited when you mentioned OCBC's garden and the turkeys in the garden and that little oasis in the city of Cambridge that has been created. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that garden and that work, because I think it's one of the really creative ways that congregations can use their land and engage with creation justice. And then also just any advice that you might have for congregations discerning what this might look like in their context.
Yeah, I am not a gardener. I'm the policy person, but I love our gardens, and Grace Peters and Sue Schrain are our two lead gardeners. And it's just so beautiful to just, when you come to the building, and even if you're in a rush to get to a meeting or to worship late, and it just makes you stop and breathe and just appreciate the beauty and be centered in it. There's also the very practical things about water retention and the prevention of flooding, and the creation of corridors for migration for birds and butterflies and things like that, when you have the native plants along the way in environments that are increasingly urban and increasingly don't have those spots. So I guess what I would encourage folks to do is look up the Sacred Grounds program that the National Wildlife Federation is sponsoring, because they are actually working with congregations to teach people how to use their property for native plants that not only beautify their property, but minimize the flooding from stormwater runoff, and create these environments that are just so helpful to the local wildlife, and also just beautiful for the neighbors, and very often also engage the neighbors in the neighborhood, and it spreads from the congregation out into the neighborhood, and engages, brings children sometimes into the garden to learn things, and other neighbors who then can go out and replicate it. So that's what I would say about gardens. Other advice for other congregations: number one, stay grounded and connected by faith. This is hard work. It's sometimes terrifying work. I mean, people, I've seen it said, however bad you think the climate crisis is, it's worse than that, So there's grief and there's anguish, but there's also a lot of joy and depth in the connection to God and creation and each other. So stay rooted in faith. 2, think globally, act locally. Really, I mean, that's the old saying. But there is an environmental justice crisis near you, near your church, wherever you are. Maybe it's a Black, Brown, Indigenous, or low wealth white community that's being overburdened by pollution or waste, or perhaps there's a dirty energy project that's proposed for siting in your community. Perhaps you could become a resilience hub through Crew with the help of Creation Justice Ministries, and help your congregants and your neighborhood be better prepared for climate emergencies. And perhaps your state legislature is considering bills that will make things better or worse that call for your advocacy. And that's where it gets complicated, because it gets really wonky. But there are entry level places. Like right now in Massachusetts, there's a big climate bill that's it's a long story, but we think maybe about to finally be signed into law, that people have been working on for years. But there's just really entry level things like call the governor and say, sign the climate bill. That doesn't take a lot of wonk. And then as people get engaged in the issues of policy at different levels, they can do what's comfortable for them.
Yeah.
And then the last piece of advice I would say is, don't fall into the personal purity trap. The fossil fuel industry has spent millions, maybe billions of dollars over the years, not only denying that there is a climate crisis, but to the extent that there is one, saying it's all our fault, that if we didn't demand their products, if we all just lived greener lives, and, that everything would be fine, that if we just all drove Priuses and ate less meat and all, and recycled, everything will be great. But in fact, the overwhelming majority of pollution comes from fewer than 100 companies. And so, yes, we do want to lead personally responsible lives, but we also really need to get engaged in that work of transitioning to a clean energy economy that's going to be also available and equitable to all people of all colors and incomes, and that will move us towards the surviving and thriving of our planet for future generations. So those are my pieces of advice.
That it's not just a personal commitment, but it's also a communal commitment. We're called to do this work together.
Yes, yeah. and to engage in public policy and to the extent that we can. So yeah, both in your local community, what's going on, and then in the larger political public policy arena to get engaged in the policy work, and in like writing letters to companies that are polluting and telling them to stop, writing letters to banks. There are all kinds of campaigns where you don't have to do a lot of research, campaigns online that are trying to one's called Stop the Money Pipeline, where you can sign on to tell your bank to stop funding big fossil fuel projects, or move your money to a bank that isn't. So little things like that people can do, both as individuals and as congregations, to have a bigger impact.
Well, Reverend Sowers, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to be in conversation with you today, your insights and your suggestions, and reflecting on what's been challenging in your congregation and your setting with creation justice. So thank you so much for sharing your ministry and your passion with us today around creation justice.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's been delightful to be here.